The kitchen of the Silver Moon Tavern reeked of grease and stale beer, but Arya had long since stopped noticing. Her hands moved mechanically through the mountain of dishes, scrubbing away the remnants of meals she could never afford to eat herself. Through the thin wall separating the kitchen from the dining area, she could hear the raucous laughter of the wolf pack celebrating another successful hunt. Their joy was a language she had never learned to speak, a warmth she had never been invited to share. At 23 years old, Arya had spent her entire life as a ghost among her own kind, a wolf without a wolf, a creature caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. The other servers avoided her, their noses wrinkling slightly when they passed too close, as if her packless status carried a physical stench. Perhaps to them it did. In a world where pack bonds were as essential as breathing, where the scent of family and belonging marked you as worthy, Arya carried only the neutral smell of isolation. She was a blank canvas in a gallery of masterpieces, and everyone who looked at her saw only the absence of what should have been there. The door to the kitchen slammed open, and Arya flinched, her shoulders hunching automatically into the defensive posture that had become second nature over the years. Marcus, the tavern owner and a beta from the Ironwood pack, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression thunderous. Behind him, Arya could see several well-dressed wolves peering into the kitchen with expressions of disgust and fascination, the way children might watch an exotic animal in a cage. Marcus was a heavy-set man whose authority came not from any particular strength, but from his pack connections, and he wielded that borrowed power like a club against anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath him in the social hierarchy. Arya, being at the very bottom, received the brunt of his cruelty on a regular basis. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the dish in her hands, hoping that submission might protect her from whatever storm was coming. It rarely did, but hope was a stubborn thing, even when it had been beaten down countless times before. Marcus grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave bruises. "You," he snarled, dragging her toward the door. "You're the reason we have complaints. These fine wolves from the Shadow Ridge pack say the kitchen smells wrong, that something about this place feels off. I wonder what that could be." His voice dripped with sarcasm and malice. Arya stumbled as he pulled her into the dining area, where dozens of eyes turned toward her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. The wolves from Shadow Ridge were clearly wealthy, their clothes fine and their posture radiating the confidence of those who had never known rejection or want. A young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked at Arya and actually covered her nose with a delicate handkerchief, as if Arya's mere presence was offensive to her senses. "Is that it?" the woman asked, her voice carrying the particular cruelty that often accompanied beauty and privilege. "Is that the defective one we heard about? I didn't believe such things still existed. How is it even possible for a wolf to have no pack? It's unnatural." The word hung in the air like a curse. Unnatural. It was a word Arya had heard her entire life, whispered behind hands, spoken with disgust, used to justify every cruelty and exclusion. She had been called worse, of course, broken, empty, waste of wolf blood, but unnatural somehow cut deeper because it suggested that her very existence was wrong, that the universe itself had made a mistake in allowing her to be born. She wanted to scream that she hadn't chosen this, that she would give anything to feel the pack bonds that others took for granted, to know the security of belonging somewhere. Instead, she stood silent with her eyes fixed on the floor, because speaking had never helped and often made things worse. Marcus shoved her forward slightly, presenting her to the Shadow Ridge wolves like evidence in a trial. "She's an orphan," he explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing an interesting but ultimately trivial fact. "Found as an infant on the edge of Neutral City with no pack scent, no family markers, nothing. The orphanage raised her until she was old enough to work, and now she does what labor nobody else wants. She knows her place mostly, but I apologize if her presence has disturbed your meal." The blonde woman's companion, a tall man with the bearing of a high-ranking pack member, studied Arya with cold interest. "I've heard of such cases, but they're rare. Usually the child dies without pack bonds to sustain them through the first shift. The fact that this one survives suggests either remarkable luck or remarkable stubbornness." He paused, then added almost casually, "Has she even had a first shift? Does she have a wolf at all?" The question sent a ripple of whispers through the gathered crowd. Arya felt her cheeks burn with shame because everyone in this room already knew the answer. At 23, she should have shifted for the first time years ago, should have felt her wolf rise within her and claim her place in the natural order of their kind. Instead, she remained trapped in human form, unable to access the most fundamental part of what she was supposed to be. Some said she had no wolf at all, that she was barely better than a human. Others whispered darker theories, that she had been cursed, or that her bloodline was so weak it had simply failed to produce a viable wolf. Either way, the result was the same. She was incomplete, broken, a failure at the most basic requirement of her species. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. A wolf? This thing. She's never shifted, never will. Whatever's inside her is sleeping so deep it might as well be dead. The orphanage tested her every way they knew how, tried to trigger a shift, but nothing worked. She's just taking up space, really, but she works cheap and doesn't complain, so I keep her around for the jobs nobody else will do. He released Arya's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling back toward the kitchen door. Get back to work, and make sure those dishes are spotless. I don't want any more complaints about things feeling wrong in my establishment. Arya fled to the safety of the kitchen, her eyes burning. With tears she refused to let fall. Behind her, she could hear the Shadow Ridge wolves resuming their conversation, their voices bright with the casual cruelty of those who had never known what it meant to be powerless. Someone made a joke about defective wolves being allowed to live, and the resulting laughter followed Arya like knives. She plunged her hands back into the scalding dishwater and scrubbed with renewed intensity, trying to wash away the shame and humiliation, knowing it would cling to her long after the grease and grime were gone. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have so many more incredible tales of transformation and justice coming your way, and your support means everything. Now let's continue with Arya's journey, because her story is about to take a turn that nobody, least of all those who mocked her, could have predicted. The days that followed were no better than usual, which meant they were barely tolerable. Arya worked from dawn until long after dark, scrubbing floors and washing dishes and hauling heavy crates for a wage that barely covered her tiny rented room in the worst part of Neutral City. The city itself was a strange place, one of the few locations where pack wolves and packless wolves and even humans could coexist under a carefully maintained neutrality agreement. In theory, it was a haven for those without traditional pack protection. In practice, it was a place where the most vulnerable were preyed upon by those with even a scrap of power to wield. Arya had learned to navigate its dangers through careful invisibility, making herself small and quiet and unremarkable in the hopes that she might slip through life unnoticed. It was not much of an existence, but it was survival. And survival was sometimes all you could ask for when the world had decided you didn't deserve to exist at all. On the 7th day after the incident with the Shadow Ridge wolves, everything changed. Arya was sweeping the front steps of the tavern in the early morning light when a convoy of vehicles rolled into the town square, their black paint gleaming and their engines purring with barely restrained power. Neutral City rarely saw such displays of wealth and authority, and people began emerging from buildings to watch with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Arya paused in her sweeping, her instincts screaming at her to retreat inside, to hide before whatever this was could touch her. But something held her frozen in place, some quality in the air itself that made her skin prickle and her heart race. The vehicles came to a stop, and their doors opened in perfect synchronization, revealing guards in formal black uniforms that bore the silver insignia of the High Crown. Arya's breath caught. The High Crown meant the Alpha King himself, the supreme authority over all wolf packs in the territory. She had never seen him, had never expected to see him. Kings did not visit places like Neutral City, did not concern themselves with the lives of packless orphans scrubbing tavern floors. But then he emerged from the central vehicle, and Arya understood immediately why entire packs bent their knees to this male. Alpha King Cassius was tall and powerfully built, his dark hair swept back from a face that combined aristocratic beauty with the hard edges of a warrior who had earned his throne through blood and dominance. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Arya would make in her entire lifetime, and he moved with the fluid confidence of a predator who had never once doubted his right to rule. Power radiated from him in waves that made every wolf in the vicinity instinctively lower their eyes and bare their throats in submission. Every wolf except Arya, who stood frozen on the tavern steps with her broom in her hands, staring at him like a fool, because she had never felt anything like the sensation that crashed over her when their eyes met. It was as if the world had suddenly come into sharp focus after a lifetime of blurred edges, as if every color had become more vivid and every sound more clear. Her chest ached with a longing so intense it was almost painful, and somewhere deep inside her, in the place where her wolf should have been, she felt something stir for the first time in her life. The Alpha King's eyes locked onto hers across the square, and his entire body went rigid. His nostrils flared as he drew in a deep breath. And even from this distance, Arya saw his pupils dilate with shock, and something else. Something hungry and possessive that made her stomach flip with a confusing mixture of fear and anticipation. Around him, his guards shifted nervously, clearly sensing the change in their king, but not understanding its source. One of them, a woman with sharp features and the bearing of a high-ranking warrior, leaned close to Cassius and murmured something Arya couldn't hear. The king raised one hand in a gesture that silenced her immediately, his eyes never leaving Arya's face. Then he began walking toward her with long, purposeful strides that ate up the distance between them in seconds. Arya's instincts finally kicked in, and she dropped her gaze, falling into the submissive posture she had perfected over years of survival. But it was too late. He had already seen her, had already marked her with that intense stare, and now he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could smell the scent of pine and winter wind that clung to him. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice deep and carrying the weight of absolute authority. It was not a request. Arya forced herself to raise her eyes, her hands trembling where they gripped the broom handle. Up close, Cassius was even more overwhelming, his presence filling her entire field of vision until nothing else existed. His eyes were a startling shade of amber, flecked with gold, and they studied her face with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare and exposed. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice had gentled slightly, as if he sensed how close she was to bolting like a frightened deer. "Arya," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Arya, no family name, no pack." Saying it out loud to this powerful male felt like confessing to a crime, like admitting to some fundamental failure that made her unworthy of his attention. But Cassius didn't recoil in disgust the way she expected. Instead, his expression shifted into something she couldn't quite read, a combination of wonder and frustration and fierce determination. "Impossible," he murmured, but he didn't seem to be speaking to her. "The fates wouldn't be so cruel as to bind me to someone so vulnerable, so unprotected." Then his eyes sharpened and focused on her again. "Can you feel it? The pull between us?" Arya didn't know how to answer, because she didn't understand what she was feeling, had no framework for interpreting the way her entire body seemed to lean toward him as if drawn by invisible strings. But she nodded hesitantly and saw satisfaction flash across his face. He reached out slowly, giving her time to flinch away, and when she didn't, he cupped her cheek with one large hand. His skin was warm against hers, and the contact sent electricity racing through her nerves. "Mate," he said softly, and the word resonated through Arya's entire being, like a bell that had finally been rung after years of silence. "You are my mate. My Luna, my queen." The square erupted into chaos. People who had been watching from a safe distance surged forward, their voices raised in shock and disbelief, and, in some cases, outrage. Marcus burst from the tavern, his face purple with confusion and anger. "Your Majesty, there must be some mistake," he blustered, his eyes darting between Cassius and Arya. "That girl, she's nobody. She's defective. She has no pack and no wolf. She can't possibly be your mate. The moon wouldn't pair you with something so beneath you." Cassius turned to Marcus with a look that could have melted steel, and the beta immediately shrank back, his bravado evaporating in the face of the Alpha King's displeasure. "You will watch your tongue when speaking about my mate," Cassius said, his voice deadly quiet, "or you will lose it along with your worthless life. Do you understand me?" Marcus nodded frantically, his throat working as he struggled to swallow his fear. Cassius turned back to Arya, and his expression softened again into something almost gentle. "Pack your belongings. You're coming with me to the capital. Your life here is over." Arya wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she had nothing to pack, that her entire existence could fit into a single worn backpack, that she didn't understand what was happening, or why a king would want someone as broken as her. But the words stuck in her throat, because part of her, the part that had been starving for belonging her entire life, wanted desperately to believe that this was real, that she had finally found the place she was meant to be. So she simply nodded and turned to go inside, aware that every eye in the square was following her, aware that her life had just transformed in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. Behind her, she heard Cassius giving orders to his guards, his voice crisp and commanding as he arranged for their departure. In the span of a few minutes, Arya had gone from being the packless orphan nobody wanted to look at, to being the mate of the most powerful wolf in the territory. It should have felt like a fairy tale, like every dream she had ever had coming true at once. Instead, it felt terrifying, because Arya knew better than most that good things never lasted, and that the higher you climbed, the farther you had to fall. The journey to the capital took most of the day, and Arya spent it in a state of numb shock, watching the landscape blur past the windows of the luxury vehicle that Cassius had placed her in. The Alpha King himself rode in a different vehicle, giving her space that she appreciated even as part of her yearned to be close to him, to understand the connection that hummed between them like a living thing. The female guard who had spoken to Cassius earlier, whose name Arya learned was Commander Sarah, sat across from her with an expression of barely concealed disapproval. "I don't know what game you're playing," Sarah said finally, her voice low and hard. "But if you think you can manipulate the king with some kind of false mate bond, you're more foolish than you look. He's under a great deal of stress right now, dealing with threats to the kingdom that you couldn't begin to understand. Whatever trick you've pulled, it won't last." Arya met her eyes with the quiet dignity that came from years of weathering cruelty. "I'm not playing any game," she said softly. "I don't even understand what's happening. But I didn't ask for this, and I certainly didn't trick anyone." Sarah snorted, unconvinced, but she didn't press the issue further. They rode in tense silence until the capital city came into view, and Arya forgot about everything else as she stared at the sprawling metropolis that served as the heart of wolf territory. She had never seen anything so magnificent. Towers of glass and steel rose toward the sky alongside older stone buildings that spoke of centuries of history. Parks and gardens broke up the urban landscape with splashes of green, and everywhere she looked, there were wolves moving with the easy confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged in the world. The royal palace sat at the city's heart, a massive structure that combined modern architecture with classical grandeur. As their convoy pulled through gates guarded by wolves, whose power she could feel even from inside the vehicle, Arya realized that she was about to enter a world she had no preparation for, no understanding of. She was a tavern worker who had spent her life scrubbing floors. How was she supposed to navigate the politics and power of a royal court? The vehicles came to a stop in a private courtyard, and Cassius was there immediately, opening Arya's door himself before any of the guards could move. He offered her his hand and she took it, allowing him to help her from the vehicle, even though her legs felt shaky and uncertain. "Welcome to your new home," he said, and there was warmth in his voice that made her chest ache. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you have questions, but first, there's something we need to address." He led her through corridors of marble and gold, past portraits of stern-looking wolves who must have been his ancestors, past guards who snapped to attention as they passed. Finally, they entered a large office dominated by a massive desk and walls lined with books. Cassius gestured for Arya to sit in one of the leather chairs facing the desk. and he took the other rather than positioning himself in the power seat behind the desk. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of consideration that Arya hadn't expected. "I brought you here for 2 reasons, Cassius began, his amber eyes serious. "The first is the mate bond, which I'm sure you felt even if you don't fully understand it. You are mine, Arya, and I am yours. The moon herself has declared it, and I will not reject that gift no matter how complicated it makes things." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that was almost vulnerable. "But the second reason is equally important. I'm in the middle of investigating a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of pack leadership across the territory. Alphas who I thought were loyal have been found taking bribes, manipulating pack justice for personal gain, and oppressing the vulnerable to maintain their own power. I need someone to help me root out this corruption, someone who can judge these cases without being influenced by pack politics or old alliances." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I need someone who stands outside the system entirely, someone who has no reason to protect the establishment that has done nothing but harm them. I need you, Arya." Arya stared at him in complete bewilderment. "Me? Judge Pack Alphas? Your Majesty, I have no authority, no education in pack law, no standing whatsoever. Those wolves would never accept judgment from someone like me." Cassius smiled, and it was a fierce expression full of sharp edges. "They will accept it because I command it. As of this moment, you are my mate and my Luna, which gives you authority second only to mine. And I am appointing you as royal judge with full power to hear cases, determine guilt, and pass sentences on any wolf in my territory. The very alphas who have spent their lives looking down on the packless and the powerless will now have to bow before one and accept her judgment. It's fitting, don't you think?" The idea was so absurd that Arya almost laughed. Almost. But the expression on Cassius's face was deadly serious, and she realized with growing horror that he meant every word. He was going to give her, a packless orphan with no wolf and no status, power over the very wolves who had tormented people like her for generations. It was either the most brilliant act of justice she had ever heard of, or it was going to get her killed. Before she could formulate a response, there was a sharp knock on the door, and Commander Sarah entered. Without waiting for permission, her expression urgent. "Your Majesty, we have a problem. Alpha Drake of the Ironwood Pack has arrived demanding an audience. He's heard about your new mate, and he's brought several other alphas with him. They're in the throne room making quite a scene." Cassius's jaw tightened with anger. Drake. Of course it would be him. He's one of the primary suspects in the bribery investigation. He stood and offered his hand to Arya. "Come, you might as well meet them now. And Arya, remember this. You are my mate. You are my Luna. You bow to no one but me, and even then, only when we're alone." He said the last part with a hint of heat that made Arya's cheeks flush. Then he was leading her through more corridors, and she could hear raised voices echoing from somewhere ahead, angry and demanding. "Don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what you think will happen when Arya faces the alphas who have spent their lives believing she's beneath them. Will she find her courage, or will the weight of their judgment crush her? And please, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. This story is just getting started, and the transformations ahead will leave you breathless." The throne room was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Massive columns soared toward a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of legendary wolf battles and celestial events. The throne itself sat on a raised dais, carved from dark stone and inlaid with silver, that caught the light from enormous windows. But Arya barely noticed any of it, because her attention was captured entirely by the group of alphas standing in the center of the room, their postures aggressive, and their faces twisted with varying degrees of outrage and contempt. There were perhaps a dozen of them, all male, all radiating the kind of power that came from lifetimes of unquestioned authority, and at their center stood a wolf Arya, recognized with a jolt of shocked recognition. Alpha. Drake of the Ironwood Pack was Marcus's alpha, the leader of the pack that had allowed Arya to be treated like garbage in their territory for her entire life. He was a thick-bodied man with gray streaking his dark hair and small, mean eyes that had never once looked at Arya with anything resembling kindness. Drake's eyes locked onto Arya as she entered beside Cassius, and his lip curled with disgust. "So it's true," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've actually claimed the defective orphan as your mate, Your Majesty. I say this with the utmost respect, but you've been deceived. That girl has no wolf, no pack, no value whatsoever. She spent her entire life as a burden on my territory, taking up space and resources that should go to real wolves. Whatever she's told you, whatever tricks she's used to convince you there's a mate bond, it's a lie. She's probably worked with some witch to create a false bond, hoping to elevate herself beyond her pathetic station." The other alphas murmured in agreement, their eyes on Arya full of the same contempt she had endured her whole life. One of them, a younger male with aristocratic features, actually laughed. This is what happens when a king isolates himself for too long. He becomes vulnerable to manipulation by clever parasites. We should have her examined by pack elders, have them verify whether a true bond exists or if this is some kind of magical fraud. Arya felt something crack inside her chest, a protective shell. She had built around her heart to survive years of exactly this kind of dismissal. These wolves didn't know her, had never bothered to see her as anything more than a convenient target for their cruelty. And now they stood in the throne room of their king and called her a liar and a fraud without a single moment of hesitation. The injustice of it, the casual certainty with which they dismissed her humanity, ignited something she had spent her whole life suppressing: rage. Not the hot, explosive, kind, but the cold, determined fury of someone who had finally had enough. Beside her, Cassius had gone utterly still, in the way that predators do before they strike, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, laced with lethal promise. "You will address my mate with the respect due to your Luna, or you will lose the privilege of speech permanently. Every word you speak against her is a challenge to me, and I promise you, I am in no mood to be merciful with challenges." Today, Drake had the sense to look uncertain, but he pressed forward anyway, driven by years of unchallenged authority and the arrogance of believing himself untouchable. "Your Majesty, I mean no disrespect to you, but that girl cannot be Luna. The kingdom needs a queen with proper bloodlines, with pack connections, with the strength to bear the weight of leadership. What you're feeling might be attraction, might even be some kind of bond, but it cannot be a true mate bond, because the moon would never pair you with something so fundamentally broken. I'm asking you to reconsider this decision before you damage the stability of the entire kingdom." There was a moment of ringing silence, and then Cassius laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of a king who had just been given the perfect excuse to unleash the violence he had been holding back. "Damage the stability of the kingdom?" he repeated, his voice soft and dangerous. "You want to talk to me about stability. Drake, let's talk about the stability you've been undermining. Let's talk about the bribes you've been taking from developers to ignore environmental protections in your territory. Let's talk about the pack members you've exiled for speaking against your corruption. Let's talk about the young wolves you failed to protect, because their families couldn't pay your illegal fees." The color drained from Drake's face as Cassius laid out his crimes with calm precision. Around him, the other alphas shifted nervously, clearly wondering what information the king had on them. Cassius smiled, and it was a terrible expression full of teeth and promise. "I've been investigating all of you for months. I have evidence of bribery, extortion, abuse of power, and a dozen other crimes that violate the sacred trust between alphas and their packs. I was going to handle this quietly, give you chances to step down with some dignity and tact, but you've just made a critical mistake. You've insulted my mate, questioned my judgment, and threatened the stability you claim to care about. So now we're going to do this publicly, and we're going to do it right now." He turned to Arya, and his expression softened into something almost gentle. "My Luna, as royal judge, I present these alphas to you for judgment. They stand accused of corruption, abuse of power, and violations of pack law, too numerous to list individually. Will you hear their cases?" Arya's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run, to hide from the enormous responsibility being placed on her shoulders. These were alphas, wolves with more power in their smallest finger than she had in her entire body. They could crush her without effort, could destroy her with a word. But then she looked at their faces, saw the contempt and the certainty that she would never dare to challenge them, saw the same expression that had been on the faces of every wolf who had ever hurt her, or dismissed her, or treated her like she was less than nothing. And she thought about all the other powerless wolves out there, all the orphans and the packless, and the weak who had no one to stand between them, and the cruelty of those who believed might made right. "I will hear their cases," Arya said, and was shocked to find that her voice was steady and clear. "But not here. If I'm to judge them properly, I need to understand the full extent of their crimes and hear from those they've harmed. Your Majesty, I request time to investigate and gather testimony before rendering judgment." Cassius's eyes blazed with pride, and something else, something heated that made Arya's stomach flutter with nervous awareness. "Granted," he said. "You have full authority to access all evidence I've gathered, to question anyone you need to question, and to conduct your investigation however you see fit. These alphas will remain in the capital under guard until you're ready to render your verdicts." Drake sputtered with outrage. "You can't keep us here like common criminals. We have territories to run, packs to lead." Cassius turned to him with eyes that had gone cold and merciless. "You should have thought about that before you betrayed the trust your packs placed in you. Guards, escort these alphas to the detention wing. They are to be treated with the courtesy due their rank, but they are not to leave the palace grounds or communicate with their territories without supervision." As the guards moved to comply, Drake made one last desperate play. He turned to Arya, his expression shifting from contempt to something that might have been meant as pleading. "Girl, you know what it's like to have nothing, to be nothing. Don't let the king use you as a weapon against your own kind. We're all wolves here, all part of the same world. Have mercy." Arya met his eyes and spoke with a calm that surprised even herself. "You're right that I know what it's like to have nothing. I know what it's like to be powerless, while those with authority abuse it without consequence. That's exactly why I'm the perfect person to judge you, Alpha Drake. Because I understand the cost of your crimes in ways you never could. You'll get justice. But it will be real justice. Not the kind you're used to where power and connections matter more than truth." Drake's face twisted with fury. But before he could respond, the guards were ushering him and the other alphas from the throne room, their protests echoing down the corridors until distance swallowed the sound. When they were finally alone except for a handful of trusted guards, Cassius pulled Arya into his arms with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the dominant power radiating from him. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her hair. "I knew you would be. The moon knew what she was doing when she made us mates." Arya allowed herself to lean into his strength for just a moment, drawing comfort from his solid presence even as her mind spun with everything that had just happened. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I don't know the first thing about being a judge, about conducting investigations or determining guilt. What if I fail? What if I let innocent wolves suffer, or let guilty ones go free?" Cassius pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his amber eyes intense and focused entirely on her. "Then you'll learn. You'll make mistakes and you'll correct them. But Arya, I've watched alphas judge cases for years. And you know what I've learned? The ones who are most certain they know everything are usually the ones who understand the least. Your doubt, your awareness of how much you don't know, that's what will make you a better judge than any of those arrogant fools who think power gives them wisdom." He brushed his thumb across her cheekbone in a gesture that was achingly tender. "Besides, you won't be alone in this. I'll give you advisors, access to every legal expert in the kingdom, whatever resources you need. And more than that, you'll have me. We're mates, Arya. Your victories are mine, your struggles are mine, your journey is mine. We'll figure this out together." The mate bond hummed between them, warm and insistent, and Arya felt her wolf stir again in that deep place where it had always hidden. It was still faint, still uncertain, but it was there. For the first time in her life, she felt the beginning of something that might be wholeness. "Why? Me?" she asked, needing to understand. "You could have any wolf in the kingdom. You could have a mate with power and connections and all the things I don't have. Why would the moon pair you with someone so completely unsuited to being a queen?" Cassius smiled, and this time it was soft and genuine. "Maybe because I don't need a queen who knows how to play political games, or who comes from the right bloodlines. Maybe I need a queen who understands what it means to suffer, who knows the cost of injustice from personal experience, who will never forget what it's like to be powerless. You're not unsuited to being queen, Arya. You're exactly what this kingdom needs, even if it doesn't know it yet." The words settled into Arya's chest like seeds, fragile but full of potential. She didn't quite believe them. Not yet, but she wanted to. After a lifetime of being told she was worthless, having someone as powerful as the Alpha King tell her she was exactly what was needed felt like standing in sunlight after years in shadow. It was terrifying and overwhelming and desperately, dangerously tempting. "I'll try," she said finally. "I can't promise I'll be good at this, but I'll try." Cassius's smile widened. "That's all anyone can ask. Now come, let me show you to your quarters. You'll need rest before you begin your investigation, and we have much to discuss about how to present you to the court as my Luna." He offered his arm, and Arya took it, allowing him to lead her deeper into the palace that was now, impossibly, her home. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Arya reeling. Cassius had assigned her a suite of rooms that were larger than any building she had ever lived in, decorated with a luxury that made her uncomfortable, even as part of her marveled at the beauty of it all. He had also assigned her a team of advisors, including legal experts, investigators, and even a tutor to help her understand the complexities of pack law and royal protocol. Commander Sarah remained disapproving but professional, clearly following orders even if she didn't agree with them. And through it all, Arya threw herself into understanding the cases against the corrupt alphas with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. She spent hours poring over financial records that detailed bribes and embezzlement, reading witness statements from pack members who had suffered under their alpha's cruelty, learning the intricate web of laws and traditions that governed wolf society. It was overwhelming and exhausting and utterly fascinating. For the first time in her life, Arya had a purpose beyond mere survival, had a task that mattered and might actually make a difference in the lives of wolves who had no one else to advocate for them. She also insisted on interviewing the victims directly, over the objections of some of her advisors, who thought it unseemly for the Luna to spend time with common pack members. Arya ignored them and traveled, under guard to various territories, sitting in modest homes and listening to stories that broke her heart. She heard from Omegas who had been forced into unwanted matings because they couldn't pay the fees their alphas demanded for choice. She heard from young wolves who had been denied access to pack resources and education unless their families could afford the illegal tolls. She heard from families who had been torn apart when members were exiled for speaking against corruption. Each story added fuel to the cold rage burning in Arya's chest, the determination to ensure these alphas faced real consequences for their actions. And each story also taught her something crucial about the systemic nature of the corruption she was uncovering. These weren't isolated incidents or individual bad actors. This was a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to flourish because those with power protected each other, and those without power had no voice to speak against them. One evening, Arya returned to the palace exhausted from a particularly difficult day of interviews to find Cassius waiting for her in her sitting room. He had been giving her space to work, appearing at formal dinners, and checking in regularly, but not overwhelming her with his presence. The mate bond thrummed between them constantly, a warm awareness that was both comforting and unsettling. Arya was deeply attracted to him, felt drawn to him in ways that had nothing to do with logic or reason, but she was also terrified of becoming dependent on someone when her entire life had taught her that depending on anyone was dangerous. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Cassius said without preamble, his amber eyes taking in the exhaustion that must have been evident on her face. "My advisors tell me you barely sleep, that you're working 16-hour days trying to understand every detail of these cases." Arya sank into a chair, too tired to maintain proper protocol. If I'm going to judge these wolves, I need to understand exactly what they've done. I can't afford to make mistakes or miss important details. Too many people are depending on the outcome. Cassius moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his much larger ones. The gesture was shockingly intimate and gentle from a king, from an alpha who could command armies with a word. "You care," he said softly. "You actually care about getting it right, about serving justice rather than revenge. Do you know how rare that is? Especially in someone who has every reason to want revenge." Arya met his eyes, seeing her own reflection in those amber depths. Revenge would be easy. Revenge would feel good in the moment. But what would it accomplish? Those alphas deserve to be punished for what they've done, but their packs also need to heal and move forward. If I approach this with vengeance in my heart, I'll just perpetuate the same cycle of harm that's been going on for generations. I want to break the cycle, not continue it. Cassius's expression shifted into something that looked almost like awe. "You're going to be an amazing queen," he said. "Not because of your bloodline or your power, but because of your heart. Because you understand that real strength isn't about domination. It's about service and sacrifice for those who depend on you." He stood and pulled her to her feet, drawing her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Arya rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability and connection. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Scared I'll fail. Scared I'll let people down. Scared that everyone is right, and I'm not suited for this role." Cassius's arms tightened around her. "Fear is good. Fear keeps you humble and careful. It's the people without fear, the ones who are absolutely certain they're right, who make the most dangerous leaders. Be scared, Arya, but don't let that fear stop you from doing what you know is right." They stood like that for a long moment, two souls bound together by the moon's design, finding comfort in each other's presence. Finally, Cassius pulled back slightly and looked at her with an expression that was both tender and heated. "There's something else we need to discuss. The full moon is in 3 days. The court is expecting us to complete the mate bond in the traditional ceremony. Are you ready for that?" Arya's cheeks flushed because she knew exactly what completing the bond meant. It wasn't just a political union or a spiritual connection. It would involve the physical consummation of their relationship, would bind them together in ways that could never be undone. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Part of me wants it desperately, but part of me is terrified. I've never been with anyone, never even been touched with kindness by another wolf. What if I'm not what you need? What if the bond isn't as strong as it should be because my wolf is defective?" Cassius cupped her face in his hands, his expression fierce. "Your wolf is not defective. I don't know why she hasn't emerged yet, but I can feel her, Arya. She's there, waiting for the right moment. And as for the rest, we'll go at whatever pace you need. The bond is already there, already real. The ceremony just acknowledges it publicly and deepens the connection. We can wait as long as you need before taking that final step." His understanding and patience only made Arya want him more, made her heart ache with the knowledge that this powerful male was willing to wait for her, to put her comfort above his own desires. She made a decision then, one that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "I don't want to wait," she said. "I want to complete the bond during the full moon ceremony. I want to stand before the court as your true mate and your Luna. I'm ready." The smile that broke across Cassius's face was brilliant and filled with such joy that it took Arya's breath away. He kissed her. Then, gently at first, and then with growing passion, and Arya felt her wolf surge toward the surface with more strength than ever before, drawn by the mate bond and the promise of completion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cassius rested his forehead against hers and whispered, 3 days. In 3 days, you'll be mine in every way that matters, and I'll be yours. The court won't know what hit them. Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Arya's wolf will finally emerge during the mating ceremony? And what judgments should she pass on the corrupt alphas? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more transformative stories. Now let's see what happens when Arya finally takes her place as Luna and judge. The full moon ceremony was held in the ancient stone circle that had served as the site of royal matings for centuries. Thousands of wolves from across the territory had gathered to witness their king claim his mate, and the air hummed with power and anticipation. Arya stood in a preparation chamber wearing a gown of silver silk that seemed to capture and reflect the moonlight, her hair adorned with crystals that marked her as Luna. She should have felt like an imposter, like a fraud playing dress-up in clothes she didn't deserve. Instead, she felt something else entirely. She felt ready. Her team of advisors had helped her prepare not just for the ceremony, but for the judgments she would pass the following day. She had reviewed every piece of evidence, considered every testimony, consulted with legal experts about appropriate sentences and restorative measures. She had worked harder in the past weeks than she had in her entire life, and she was confident in her decisions. The corrupt alphas would face justice, their victims would be heard and compensated, and the systems that had allowed such abuse would be reformed. It wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't undo the harm that had been done. But it was a start, and starts were important. Commander Sarah entered the chamber, her expression still guarded but less hostile than before. "It's time, Luna. The king is waiting." Arya took a deep breath and followed her out into the stone circle. The crowd fell silent as she emerged, thousands of eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to outright hostility. She knew what they saw: a packless orphan with no wolf and no status, somehow elevated to the highest position in wolf society. She knew that many of them thought her unworthy, thought Cassius had made a terrible mistake, but she also knew that their opinions didn't matter as much as what she did with the power she had been given. Cassius stood at the center of the circle beneath the full moon, magnificent in formal robes that proclaimed his rank and power. When he saw Arya, his entire face lit up with such naked emotion that several wolves in the crowd actually gasped. He crossed to her in quick strides and took her hands in his, raising them to his lips in a gesture of reverence that seemed at odds with his dominant alpha nature. "My mate," he said, his voice carrying across the circle with preternatural clarity. "My Luna, my queen. I claim you before the moon and before my people. Do you accept this claim?" Arya's voice was steady and clear. "I accept, my king, my mate, my alpha. I claim you in return and pledge myself to you and to the people we will serve together." Tenako. Traditional words felt powerful on her tongue, felt like a promise and a transformation all at once. Cassius pulled her close and kissed her deeply, and the crowd erupted into howls of approval and celebration. But even as the kiss deepened, and Arya felt the mate bond flare with heat and light, she was aware of something else happening. Inside her, in that deep place where her wolf had always hidden, something was stirring. The sensation built slowly at first, a warmth spreading through her. Bones, a pressure building beneath her skin. Then it intensified, became almost painful, and Arya gasped and broke the kiss, staggering back from Cassius with her hand pressed to her chest. "Arya?" Cassius's voice was sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" But Arya couldn't answer because every nerve in her body was on fire, because her bones were shifting and changing in ways they never had before, because her wolf was finally rising. She fell to her knees in the center of the stone circle and felt her body begin to shift for the first time in her life. It should have been agonizing. Instead, it felt like coming home, like finding a piece of herself that had always been missing. The transformation was faster than it should have been for a first shift, driven by the power of the completed mate bond and the full moon overhead. When it was finished, Arya stood on 4 legs instead of 2, her body covered in fur that gleamed silver in the moonlight, her senses exploding with input she had never experienced before. She could smell everything, hear everything, feel the power of the earth beneath her paws and the moon above calling to her wolf soul. And she was big, not as large as an alpha's wolf, but far bigger than an omega's should have been. She was the size of a beta at least, possibly larger, and the power radiating from her made several wolves in the crowd take nervous steps backward. Cassius shifted into his own wolf form, a massive black creature whose alpha power was evident in every line of his body. He approached Arya carefully, as if afraid she might bolt, and touched his nose to hers in a gesture of greeting and acceptance. Arya felt the mate bond sing between them, felt her wolf recognize its mate with joy and fierce possessiveness. Then, something even stranger happened. The oldest elder in the circle, a woman who had served as royal advisor for 50 years, gasped and fell to her knees. "It's not possible," she breathed. The silver fur, the size, the power. She's not just any wolf. She carries the bloodline of the Moon Queen. The murmur that went through the crowd was electric with shock and wonder. The Moon Queen was a legendary figure, the first wolf queen said to have been blessed directly by the moon goddess herself. Her line had supposedly died out centuries ago, but the silver fur was said to be her mark, a sign of wolves with special power and purpose. Arya shifted back to human form, grateful when Cassius immediately wrapped her in a cloak to preserve her modesty. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "How is this possible? I'm an orphan. I have no bloodline." The elder approached, her ancient eyes bright with knowledge and something that might have been regret. "You were hidden," she said softly. "Someone went to great lengths to suppress your wolf and hide your heritage. The question is why, and who had the power and knowledge to do such a thing?" Cassius's expression had gone hard and dangerous. "We'll find out," he promised. "But tonight is for celebration, not investigation. My mate has finally claimed her wolf, has revealed power that puts her beyond question as my Luna. Let anyone who doubted her worth see what the moon has blessed us with." The celebration that followed was wild and joyful. Thousands of wolves shifting and running under the full moon, their howls echoing across the territory. Arya ran with them, her new wolf form reveling in sensations she had been denied her entire life. She could feel the earth speaking to her paws, could sense the other wolves around her as points of light and warmth in her awareness. And always, she felt Cassius beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of new experiences. When they finally returned to the palace in the early hours of morning, exhausted and exhilarated, Cassius led her to his chambers, rather than her own. The completion of the mate bond had one final step, and they both knew it was time. What passed between them in the privacy of those rooms was sacred and intense, a joining that was physical and spiritual and magical all at once. When it was done, Arya lay in her mate's arms feeling complete in a way she had never imagined possible. The mate bond was fully formed now, unbreakable and eternal, and through it she could feel Cassius's emotions as clearly as her own. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, the words simple but weighted with truth. "I think I have since the moment I saw you standing on those tavern steps with your broom, looking at me like you couldn't quite believe I was real." Arya smiled against his chest. "I love you too, even though you're arrogant and bossy and entirely too sure of yourself." Cassius laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "You forgot incredibly handsome and blessed with exceptional judgment for recognizing your worth immediately." She swatted him playfully, then sobered. "Tomorrow I have to pass judgment on the alphas. Tomorrow everything changes again." Cassius's arms tightened around her. "Tomorrow you'll be magnificent, just as you were tonight. Those alphas are about to learn that power without accountability is nothing, and that the wolves they dismissed and despised can rise to judge them. It's going to be beautiful to watch." And Arya believed him, believed in herself and in the purpose she had found, believed that maybe, just maybe, she could help create a world where no one else had to feel as powerless and worthless as she had felt for so many years. The throne room the following afternoon was packed beyond capacity. Wolves crammed into every available space to witness the unprecedented event of a newly claimed Luna passing judgment on some of the most powerful alphas in the territory. Arya wore formal robes in silver and black that marked her as both Luna and royal judge, and she sat in a chair that had been placed beside Cassius's throne, elevated just slightly below his, to indicate her authority. The 12 alphas stood in the center of the room under guard, their expressions ranging from defiant to terrified, depending on how much they understood about the evidence Arya had gathered. Alpha Drake looked particularly gray and shrunken, as if he had finally grasped that his power and connections would not save him from the consequences of his actions. Arya had spent the morning reviewing her decisions one final time, making sure she was confident in every judgment and sentence. Now she stood, and the murmur of conversation in the throne room died instantly. "I have reviewed the evidence against these alphas," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the space. "I have read the financial records, the witness statements, the documentation of their crimes. I have also personally interviewed dozens of their victims, hearing first-hand accounts of the harm they've caused. What I've learned has convinced me that the corruption we're addressing today is not simply about individual bad actors. It's about a system that has allowed those with power to abuse it without consequence, a system that has prioritized the comfort of the privileged over the safety of the vulnerable. That system ends today." She gestured to Drake. "Alpha Drake, you stand accused of accepting bribes, illegally taxing pack members for basic services that should have been provided freely, and using exile as a weapon against those who spoke against you. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and you have not presented any defense that contradicts the facts. I find you guilty on all charges." Drake's face flushed with anger. "You have no right to judge me. You're nothing but a packless orphan who got lucky enough to trick the king into believing you're his mate. Your bloodline means nothing, your silver fur means nothing, and your judgments will be overturned the moment the king comes to his senses." Cassius started to rise, fury written across his face, but Arya held up a hand to stop him. She could handle this herself. She walked down from the dais until she stood directly in front of Drake, meeting his eyes with a calm that came from finally understanding her own worth. "You're right that I was packless," she said quietly. "You're right that I have no traditional power or connections, but that's exactly why I'm the perfect person to judge you. I know what it feels like to be powerless under your rule. I know what it means to work until your hands bleed for wages that barely cover survival. I know what it's like to be dismissed and degraded and treated as if your existence is an inconvenience. And because I know these things, I will never forget the cost of corruption and abuse of power." She stepped back, her voice strengthening. "Your sentence is as follows. You are permanently stripped of your alpha title and all associated authority. The Ironwood Pack will select a new alpha through democratic process with oversight from the crown. You will return every penny you gain through illegal fees and bribes, and those funds will be distributed among the pack members you harmed. You will serve 10 years of supervised community service, working directly with the packless and the vulnerable to understand the consequences of your actions. And you will submit to regular evaluation by pack elders and crown representatives to ensure you're genuinely reformed before you're allowed to rejoin society as a regular pack member." The severity of the sentence sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Drake would lose everything that had given his life meaning and status, would be reduced to the level of those he had once looked down upon. It was harsh, but not cruel, punishing but not vindictive. It offered the possibility of redemption while ensuring real accountability and consequences. Arya moved on to the next alpha, and the next, carefully laying out the evidence against each one and pronouncing sentences calibrated to their specific crimes and circumstances. Some received permanent exile from their territories. Others lost their titles, but were allowed to remain as pack members if they made restitution to their victims. One younger alpha, who had clearly been coerced by older, more corrupt leaders, received a lighter sentence focused on education and reform rather than pure punishment. Through it all, Arya maintained her composure and her commitment to justice over vengeance, even when some of the alphas responded with anger or threats. By the time she finished, every wolf in the throne room understood that something fundamental had shifted in the power structure of their society. The Luna, who had once been the lowest of the low, had proven herself capable of standing in judgment over the highest of the high. And she had done so with wisdom and fairness that impressed even those who had doubted her. When the last sentence had been pronounced and the alphas led away to begin serving their punishments, Cassius stood and pulled Arya into his arms in front of the entire court. "You were perfect," he murmured for her ears alone. "Absolutely perfect. This kingdom is going to be better because of you." Arya leaned into him, allowing herself to feel the pride and satisfaction of work well done. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Sentencing corrupt alphas was important, but real change would require reforming the systems that had allowed corruption to flourish in the first place. It would require educating new leaders, empowering the powerless, creating checks and balances that prevented abuse of authority. It would require years of sustained effort and vigilance. But for the first time in her life, Arya believed she was capable of that work. She had found her purpose, her power, and her place in the world. She was no longer the girl with no pack. She was the Luna who would ensure that no one else had to endure what she had endured, that every wolf in the kingdom had value and voice, regardless of their status or bloodline. The months that followed were busy beyond anything Arya had imagined. She worked with Cassius to implement sweeping reforms in pack governance, creating councils that gave voice to omegas and betas, and ensuring that alphas couldn't make unilateral decisions that affected their packs without oversight and accountability. She established a network of advocates for the packless and the vulnerable, wolves who could help those without traditional protection navigate the legal system and access resources. She created educational programs to train new leaders in principles of service rather than dominance, of justice rather than power. And through it all, she continued to investigate her own mysterious heritage, working with the elder, who had recognized the significance of her silver fur. What they discovered was both illuminating and disturbing. Arya's mother had indeed been from the Moon Queen bloodline, one of the last living descendants of that legendary line. But powerful wolves who feared the return of a true Moon Queen had orchestrated her murder when Arya was still an infant, then used dark magic to suppress Arya's wolf and hide her heritage, hoping she would simply fade into obscurity and eventually die without ever realizing her true nature. The conspiracy reached into some of the highest levels of wolf society, including several alphas who had since died, and a few who were still alive and now faced investigation. Cassius pursued, each lead with relentless determination, committed to ensuring that every wolf who had played a role in harming his mate and stealing her birthright faced consequences. Arya sometimes found the investigation emotionally overwhelming, learning the details of how much had been taken from her and why. But she also found strength in understanding that her survival, despite all the efforts to erase her, was a testament to the power of the Moon Queen bloodline that flowed through her veins. She had been meant to rise, meant to lead, meant to transform the world of wolves into something better. The suppression of her wolf had delayed that destiny, but not destroyed it. On the anniversary of the day Cassius had first come to Neutral City and changed her life forever, Arya stood on a balcony overlooking the capital with her mate beside her and reflected on everything that had changed. She was no longer the girl scrubbing dishes in a tavern, no longer invisible and powerless. She was Luna and royal, judge, respected and even feared by some, loved by the vulnerable wolves she had dedicated herself to protecting. Her relationship with Cassius had deepened into something that sustained and challenged her in equal measure. A partnership built on mutual respect and a shared vision for a better kingdom. And her wolf, once suppressed and hidden, now ran free and strong, silver fur gleaming under every full moon as a reminder of the legacy she carried. "Do you ever regret it?" Cassius asked, quietly, his arm around her waist. "The responsibility, the pressure, the constant work? Do you ever wish you could go back to a simpler life?" Arya considered the question seriously because she had never been one to give easy answers. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," she admitted. "Sometimes I wish I could just be responsible for myself, instead of carrying the weight of so many others' hopes and needs. But regret? No, never. This life has meaning and purpose. It's hard and complicated and sometimes overwhelming, but it matters. I matter. And that's something I never felt before you came crashing into my world." Cassius smiled and pulled her closer. You always mattered, Arya. The world just needed to catch up and recognize what the moon already knew. You were always meant for this. Always meant to be exactly who you are right now. They stood together, watching the sun set over their kingdom. Two wolves who had found each other against all odds, and who had chosen to use their bond. And their power not just for their own happiness, but for the betterment of everyone under their protection. It was not a fairy tale ending, because the work was never truly done, because there would always be new challenges and injustices to address. But it was real and earned and meaningful in ways that easy happiness could never be. Arya had been mocked and dismissed and told she was worthless her entire life. Now she stood as proof that power could come from the most unlikely sources. That those who had been broken could become the builders of something better. And that sometimes the wolves who seemed to have nothing turned out to have everything that truly mattered. The girl with no pack had become the Luna who would ensure that every wolf in the kingdom had a place to belong. That justice was more than a word spoken by the powerful. And that the moon's wisdom in creating unlikely mates and unexpected queens should never be questioned. Her journey from invisible orphan to respected leader was not a story of magical transformation or instant redemption. It was a story of hard work and sustained courage, of learning to believe in herself when no one else did, of using her pain and powerlessness not as excuses for bitterness, but as fuel for creating change. And it was a story that would inspire countless other wolves who felt powerless and invisible, showing them that their voices mattered, that their suffering had not been in vain, and that even those who seemed to have no future could rise to judge the fates of those who had once judged them unworthy. If this story moved you, if you felt Arya's journey in your own heart, please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which moment resonated with you most deeply. We create these stories to remind you that transformation is possible, that justice can prevail, and that those who seem powerless often possess the greatest strength. Thank you for joining us on Arya's journey from mockery to majesty, from invisibility to undeniable presence. Until next time, may you remember that your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it, but by the courage you show in claiming your own power and using it to lift others up.